Italian threw their slave girl for humans to make fun, but humans did wrong with her. The sky above Earth was a canvas of endless black, dotted with stars that shone cold and distant. The faint hum of machinery filled the air as the alien craft descended, its surface smooth and silver, reflecting the barren wasteland below. With a metallic groan, the hatch opened and the faint glow from within spilled out like liquid light. The figure inside hesitated, trembling as the harsh wind whipped across her skin. Ira stepped forward, her movements hesitant, her luminous eyes scanning the unfamiliar terrain. Her captors had pushed her to the edge of exhaustion, their sharp words and rough hands a constant reminder of her status. The chains around her wrists and ankles clinked softly as she moved, the weight of them dragging her further into despair. Her people, those she once trusted, had discarded her like refuse, a burden they no longer wanted to bear. The alien sky above seemed as indifferent as the ones who had abandoned her. The humans approached cautiously at first, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light of the campfires dotting the horizon. Their voices were a low murmur, rising and falling in an unfamiliar cadence that set Ira's nerves on edge. Her mind raced, searching for any fragment of her training that might help her decipher their intentions. But she knew, deep down, that her fate was sealed. She had seen the way her own people had looked at her, the way they had spoken of her, as if she were less than nothing. As the humans closed in, their hesitation gave way to something darker. Laughter bubbled up among them, coarse and mocking. One of them, a man with broad shoulders and a cruel glint in his eyes, stepped forward. His name was Gareth, though Ira didn't know it yet. He tilted his head, examining her as though she were some rare exotic animal. "Look at this," he said, his voice loud and grating. "They've sent us a gift." The others laughed, their amusement cutting through the cold night air. Ira flinched at their tone, her body instinctively curling in on itself. She didn't understand their words, but their meaning was clear. They saw her not as a person, but as a curiosity, a thing to be toyed with and discarded. Gareth reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft, iridescent patterns on her skin. Ira recoiled, her chains rattling loudly in the silence that followed. The other humans stepped closer, their interest piqued by her reaction. They jeered and prodded her, their hands rough and unkind. She tried to pull away, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nowhere to go. The humans were a wall of cruelty, their faces twisted with disdain and amusement. One of the younger men, standing slightly apart from the group, watched in silence. His name was Renek, though he hadn't yet summoned the courage to speak it aloud in her presence. He was thinner than the others, his eyes dark and restless. He shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Ira and his companions. The sight of her trembling form, her silent tears glinting in the firelight, stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't yet name. But he said nothing. Fear rooted him to the spot, the weight of his own cowardice pressing down like a heavy stone. He told himself it wasn't his place to intervene, that Gareth and the others wouldn't listen to him even if he tried. But the excuses felt hollow, each one echoing back with the sharp sting of guilt. The night dragged on, each moment an eternity for Ira. The humans' taunts grew louder, their laughter more raucous. They tugged at her hair, traced the delicate markings on her arms, and whispered cruel words she couldn't understand. Every touch felt like fire against her skin, a burning reminder of her helplessness. She bit her lip, forcing herself not to cry out. Her silence was the only shred of dignity she had left, and she clung to it desperately. Renek watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to look away, to pretend he didn't see the fear in her eyes or the way her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. But he couldn't. The image of her trembling form was seared into his mind, a constant reminder of his own inaction. As the hours passed and the humans grew weary of their cruel games, they left her alone, retreating to their makeshift shelters. Ira remained where they had left her body curled into a tight ball on the cold, hard ground. The firelight cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the tear tracks that glistened on her cheeks. Rennek hesitated, his heart pounding as he glanced at Gareth's tent. The leader's snores rumbled through the camp, a low, steady rhythm that filled the silence. Taking a deep breath, Rennek stepped forward, his footsteps light and careful. He knelt beside Ira, his movements slow and deliberate. She flinched at his approach, her wide, luminous eyes locking onto his. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand him. His voice was soft, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. He reached out, his hands trembling, and began to undo the bindings around her wrists. Ira watched him warily, her body tense and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But as the bonds fell away, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within, a faint, fragile glimmer of hope. She didn't know why this human was helping her, but in that moment she didn't care. She flexed her fingers, the sensation of freedom almost foreign after so long in chains. Rennek met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice heavy with regret. He motioned for her to follow him, his gestures slow and deliberate. Ira hesitated, her heart pounding as she glanced at the sleeping forms of the other humans. But the kindness in Rennek's eyes gave her the courage to move. She rose to her feet, her legs shaky and unsteady, and followed him into the shadows. The camp faded into the distance as they walked, the cold night air biting at their skin. Rennek led her to a small grove of trees, the branches swaying gently in the wind. He motioned for her to sit, his hand still trembling as he rummaged through the bag slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a piece of bread, offering it to her with a hesitant smile. Ira stared at the bread, her stomach twisting with hunger. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his as she took it. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she ate, the simple act filling her with a warmth she hadn't thought possible. Rennek watched her, his heart aching at the sight of her fragile form. "I don't know what they did to you," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But you're safe now, I promise." Ira didn't understand his words, but the tone of his voice was enough. She looked up at him, her luminous eyes meeting his. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a connection forged in the shared silence of their pain. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Ira allowed herself to hope. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Rennek sat beside Ira in the shadow of the trees, the first light of dawn slowly stretching across the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over the world. His eyes flickered between the horizon and her delicate, exhausted form. Ira had fallen silent after eating the bread, her eyes distant, lost in a world of her own. The tension in her shoulders had relaxed slightly, but her body remained taut, as if every muscle was prepared for flight at the slightest sound. Rennek didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say, unsure if words could even reach her after everything she had endured. He had seen cruelty before, heard stories of human beings doing terrible things to one another. But this, what they had done to Ira, was something different. It was as if they had taken all their darkest instincts and projected them onto her, a helpless, fragile alien whose only crime was her existence. His heart ached as he watched her, his mind spiraling with questions he couldn't answer. What had she been through? Why was she here? And why had the others abandoned her? He didn't know, and maybe he didn't need to know. All he knew now was that he had to protect her, even if he wasn't sure how. "Do you want to rest?" Rennek asked quietly, his voice breaking the long silence. He had no idea if she understood him, but he hoped the warmth in his tone would reach her. You must be tired. Ira looked at him, her luminous eyes reflecting the pale light of the morning sun. She said nothing, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She wasn't sure if she could trust him. After everything that had happened, how could she trust anyone? Her people had cast her aside, treated her like a thing, an object of amusement. And the humans, they had done even worse. But this human, Rennek, he was different. She could feel it in the way he had spoken to her, in the way he had freed her from her chains, in the quiet kindness that radiated from him. The thought was, foreign to her, almost unbelievable. No one had ever treated her like this, not her own kind, not the humans. But Wren's actions, small as they were, had made a crack in the cold wall around her heart. She wasn't sure if she could trust him yet, but she felt something stir deep inside her, a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still some goodness left in this world. She didn't respond verbally, but the slight softening of her expression was enough. Rennek watched her carefully, his chest tight with empathy. He had no idea how to comfort her, what words to offer, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her here, not like this. Come on, Wren said, standing up slowly. He extended his hand to her, his palm open in an offering of peace. Ira hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between his hand and his face. The fire of distrust burned brightly in her eyes, but it was slowly being smothered by the warmth of his gestures. She reached out tentatively, placing her hand in his. The moment their skin made contact, something strange surged through her. A warmth that wasn't from the sun, a strange sense of safety that she had never known. Rennek gave her a small, encouraging smile as he helped her to her feet. She wobbled slightly, her legs stiff from lack of use, and he steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. He could feel the tremors in her body, the way she tensed whenever his touch lingered too long. It broke his heart to know that she was afraid, that she had been so deeply wounded by those around her. But he also knew that fear wasn't permanent. Trust could be built, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. Ira took a cautious step forward, then another. Her movements were slow, calculated, as if she was afraid of tripping, of falling into a world that would never catch her. Rennek walked beside her, careful not to crowd her, giving her the space she needed. We need to keep moving, Rennek said quietly, glancing over his shoulder toward the camp they had left behind. His heart still raced with unease, but he had no choice. They couldn't stay in the open for long. The other humans would come looking for her, and if they found her, there was no telling what they would do. He didn't want to think about it. He just needed to get her to safety. As they walked, Ira's mind raced. She had been to Earth before, once when she was much younger. But that had been before everything had changed. She had been part of a delegation sent to observe and learn from the humans. She had known nothing of their cruelty then. But now, as she walked beside Rennek, every step she took reminded her of the shattered world she had come from. The world where she had been loved, revered. The world where she had known her place. Now she was nothing. A castaway on a strange planet, hunted and unwanted. Rennek's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'm sorry for everything that's happened to you," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I don't know what they did, but I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I'll protect you." Ira's heart skipped a beat at his words. She didn't know if she believed him, if she could believe him. But the look in his eyes, it was soft, full of a gentleness that she had long since lost faith in. She found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low and shaky. "Why? After everything?" Rennek stopped walking, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers for an answer that was hard to put into words. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "I've seen people hurt others for no reason. I don't want to be one of those people. I don't want to let the world take away someone's dignity." Ira stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. She had never heard anything like it before. Most of the humans she had encountered had been driven by their desires, by their need for power or control. But Renek was different. He didn't want anything from her. He just wanted to help. "Thank you," she whispered, the words soft and fragile. Renek smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to thank me. It's just what I'm supposed to do." They walked for hours, the sun rising higher in the sky, until they reached a small village on the outskirts of the forest. It was a quiet place, the houses made of wood and stone, surrounded by crops and fields. There was an air of peace here, an unspoken serenity that contrasted with the violence Ira had endured. Renek led her to a small cottage near the edge of the village, its door slightly ajar. "This is where I live," Renek said, his voice quiet. "It's not much, but it's safe." Ira glanced at the cottage, unsure of what to make of it. She had never trusted humans enough to let them get close, but there was. Something in Renek's presence made her feel different. Perhaps it was foolish, but for the first time since she had been abandoned, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a place for herself here. Renek opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Ira to enter first. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into the warmth of the cottage. The interior was simple, with a fire burning in the hearth and a few pieces of furniture arranged in a cozy, inviting manner. There was a small table near the window, a bookcase filled with well-worn books, and a comfortable-looking chair in the corner. "Sit," Renek said gently, motioning toward the chair. "I'll make you something to drink." Ira nodded, her movement slow, as she crossed the room and sank into the chair. The firelight flickered in her eyes, casting a soft glow across her face. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest for a moment, to breathe. It wasn't much, it wasn't home, but it was something. Renek returned a few minutes later with a steaming cup in his hands. He placed it on the small table beside her and sat down across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. Ira took the cup in her hands, her fingers brushing the warm surface. She didn't know what would come next, but for now, she was safe. And for now, that was enough. Ira held the cup between her trembling hands, the warmth spreading through her fingers and into her chest, grounding her in the moment. For the first time since she had been thrown into this cruel world, she felt like she could breathe again. The weight of the chains that had bound her for so long, both physical and emotional, was slowly starting to lift, piece by piece. But the question still gnawed at her. Could she trust Renek? Could she believe that he wouldn't turn on her like everyone else had? She had been betrayed so many times already, and the scar of that pain ran deep. She glanced up at Renek, who was watching her closely, his eyes full of quiet concern. There was something about him that made her feel safe, even though she didn't fully understand why. His kindness felt so foreign, so out of place in the world she had come from. And yet it was exactly what she needed. Her alien instincts told her to run, to keep her distance. But something inside her, something that had been buried under layers of fear and distrust, whispered to her to stay. I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met his, and for a moment she saw something in his gaze that made her heart race. It wasn't pity, it wasn't even sympathy. It was something deeper, something warmer, something real. Renek shifted in his chair, his expression softening. "There's no need to thank me. I'm just doing what's right. No one deserves to be treated like you were." Ira's lips quivered, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She didn't know how to react to him. She had spent so long being treated like an object, a tool for others' amusement, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person. She had forgotten that there were those who still believed in kindness, in justice, in doing what was right. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why me? Why are you helping me? What do you want from me?" Rennick's brow furrowed and he leaned forward slightly. "I don't want anything from you," he said quietly. "I've seen what people like you go through, and I can't just stand by and do nothing. I don't want to be like them." Ira felt a flicker of something in her chest, something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew it could easily be crushed, but she let herself feel it for just a moment. She let herself believe, just for a heartbeat, that there was still goodness in the world. For a long time they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of the wind outside. Ira sipped her drink slowly, the warmth filling her with a sense of peace she had not known in what felt like forever. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the comfort of the moment wash over her. But as quickly as the peace settled in, the cold reality of her situation crept back into her mind. She couldn't forget why she was here. She couldn't forget what had been done to her. And though Rennick was kind, though he had shown her a glimpse of something better, she knew she couldn't let her guard down completely. Not yet. "I'm sorry for what they did to you," Rennick said after a long pause, his voice quiet but sincere. "I can't even begin to imagine what you've been through, but I promise you I won't let them do it again." Ira looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't know what they did," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You don't know the things they made me do, the things they made me believe about myself." Rian's face softened with empathy. "I can't pretend to know what it's been like for you, but I do know that you don't deserve any of it. You're not what they tried to make you believe. You're not broken." Her heart clenched at his words. His kindness was like a balm to her wounds, but the scars were still there. They were deep, etched into her soul. The idea that someone could see her as something other than a broken thing, something other than a discarded object, was almost too much to bear. But it felt real. His words felt real. And for the first time in so long, Ira wanted to believe them. "I don't know if I can ever believe that," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I've been taught for so long that I'm nothing but a tool, a thing for others to use." Rian's eyes softened and he reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "I don't care what they taught you. You're not a thing, Ira. You're a person. You have value. You're more than what they did to you." Ira looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The touch of his hand was gentle, comforting, yet it sent a shock of warmth through her entire body. She had been touched so many times before, but it had always been with cruelty, with disdain. This was different. It was tender, caring. She couldn't remember the last time someone had shown her such kindness without expecting anything in return. "I don't know how to live like that," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be what you're asking me to be." Rian gave her a small smile, his hand still resting on hers. "You don't have to know. You just have to take it one step at a time, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Ira's heart fluttered in her chest, a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Part of her wanted to pull away, to run, to hide from this strange, vulnerable feeling that was beginning to stir within her. But another part of her, one she hadn't known existed, wanted to stay, to allow herself to believe that something good could come from this. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you." Rian's gaze softened even more, and he gently squeezed her hand. "I understand. It's not easy. But I promise you, Ira, I won't hurt you. I'm not like them." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something that made her believe. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that there was still hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Reen smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me. Just trust me, okay? We'll figure this out together." Ira nodded slowly, still unsure but willing to take the first step. She didn't know what the future held or what her place in this strange new world was. But for now, as she sat in the warmth of the cottage with Reen's presence beside her, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for her to be something more than what the world had tried to make her. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Ira's journey had been one of endless uncertainty, pain, and disillusionment. But the path she had chosen to walk, the one that led her from the darkness into a small fragment of light, was beginning to feel like something more than just an escape. It was a new beginning. With Reen by her side, each day brought new revelations about herself, her worth, and the world around her. The cottage they shared had become more than just a shelter from the storm. It had become a place of healing, a quiet haven where Ira could finally breathe and where she could learn to trust again. But no matter how much peace she had found in this place, there was always that lingering fear, that cold knot in her stomach, reminding her of the world she had come from, the world that had thrown her away without a second thought. And even in the sanctuary of Reen's kindness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was never truly safe. As the days turned into weeks, Ira had tried to push aside the constant dread, the need to remain on guard. Reen had never given her a reason to doubt him, and yet the scars of her past clung to her like shadows. He noticed it, of course. He noticed how her hands would tremble when she thought no one was looking, how her eyes would flicker to the door every time a sound stirred outside. "Are you okay?" Reen asked one evening, his voice low as he sat beside her by the fire. His hand brushed against hers, and she couldn't help but flinch slightly. He pulled his hand back, concern flickering in his eyes. "I'm fine," she lied, offering him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just tired?" Reen wasn't fooled. "You know you don't have to pretend with me. You've been through so much, and it's okay to let yourself feel it." Ira swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him everything, the nightmares that plagued her sleep, the suffocating memories of the alien masters who had used her, discarded her, and made her believe she was worthless. She wanted to tell him how deeply the scars ran, how much she had longed for a moment of peace, of safety. But she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. Not yet. "I'll be okay," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just need time." Reen nodded, his expression soft. "Take all the time you need. I'm here for you whenever you're ready." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with an understanding that Ira hadn't thought she would ever experience. In that silence, she realized something profound. She didn't need to heal all at once. She didn't need to be whole right away. All she needed was time and the courage to take the next step, even if it was small. That night, as they both lay down in the small bed they shared, Ira couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying everything: the cruel treatment, the degradation, the lies. But as the night deepened, something began to change. It wasn't instant, nor was it a grand revelation. It was quiet, subtle, a shift in her heart. She turned her head to find Reen lying beside her, his eyes closed in peaceful slumber. There was something so simple, so pure in his presence. He was not a savior. He was not here to fix her or to make her forget her past. He was simply there, as he had always been, a steady presence in the storm of her life. And that was enough. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the small window, Era felt a sense of clarity settle over her. It wasn't just hope she had started to feel. It was trust, not just in Reen, but in herself. She trusted that she could rebuild her life piece by piece, without having to erase the pain that had shaped her. She could move forward without forgetting who she had been, because every part of her past, every scar, had led her to this moment. This was her new reality, her new path, and she wasn't going to let fear of the past control her future. The days that followed were not without their challenges. There were times when the memories crept up on her, when the old feelings of worthlessness and fear resurfaced. But each time she found herself growing stronger. Each time Reen was there, not as a hero, but as someone who simply cared for her, who respected her and didn't expect anything in return. One evening, as they walked through the forest, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the path ahead, Ira turned to Reen. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Reen looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Ready for what?" "To let go," she whispered, "to stop carrying the past with me. I can't change what's happened, but I don't have to let it define me anymore." Reen stopped walking, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "Ira, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, always." Her heart swelled at his words. There was no grand gesture, no promise of a perfect future, just a simple truth. She wasn't alone. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of that truth. She had a future now, one that was no longer shackled by the pain of her past. Over the following weeks, Ira began to embrace her newfound freedom in ways she never thought possible. She learned to laugh again, even if it was a quiet laugh, one that only Reen could coax out of her. She began to help him around the cottage, tending to the garden and fixing the small things that needed repair. For the first time in a long while, she felt useful. And that sense of usefulness didn't come from being a tool for someone else. It came from within herself. Reen watched her transformation with quiet pride. He saw the way she held her head a little higher, the way her smile had become more genuine. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live again. And though he never spoke of it, he knew that she had found a piece of herself she had thought lost forever. One day, as they sat on the porch of their cottage, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, Ira turned to Reen and asked, "Do you ever think about the future?" Reen looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I do," he replied, "but I try not to worry about it too much. The future is a long way off. Right now, I'm just happy to be here with you." Ira felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had never allowed herself to think about the future before. She had been too afraid, too focused on survival. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to picture a life beyond the pain, beyond the memories. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said quietly, her voice filled with a new sense of conviction. Reen's eyes softened and he reached for her hand. "Good," he said, "because you don't have to be afraid. Not anymore." As the night fell and the stars began to twinkle above them, Ira sat back, her head resting on Reen's shoulder. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She wasn't whole yet. She didn't have all the answers. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. She didn't need to be fixed. She didn't need anyone to save her. She was enough. And that was all that mattered.